Well, as that court hearing continues, more migrants rescued from the Mediterranean arriving in Sicily on an Italian ship. This has been a common sight throughout this week, certainly. 84 people, all of them taken from a sinking rubber boat in the seas off Libya by the Italian Coast Guard overnight. As we look at those pictures, let's ponder this question: how to solve the crisis. Analysts are still assessing a deal agreed by EU leaders last night in Brussels. After their meeting, they say the immediate priority must be, quite simply, to save lives. So funding for operations in the Mediterranean is being tripled to €9 million or £6.5 million every month. Britain and the UK offering to send the warship HMS Bulwark, as well as 3 helicopters and patrol boats to help boost the search and rescue options in the southern Mediterranean. And the leaders agreed to push for a UN resolution which would allow states to destroy people's smugglers' vessels. Let's talk about this and do so in the company of Tony Smith, the former head of the UK Border Force, and the playwright and activist Anders Lusgaard. Gentlemen, a very good morning to both of you. Anders, if I can begin with you. For some people, this appears to be a choice between Europe being big-hearted and the humanitarian crisis that they face, which involves numbers which few people, frankly, can get their heads around.
Yeah, I'm not really sure it's a question of big-hearted as much as it is of an important human compassion, but also of understanding the responsibility of the West in causing migration, which is something we don't talk about enough. One of the real drivers behind migration is actually the impact of development banks in poor countries. So the World Bank displaced 3.4 million people in the last 10 years, and those people have to go somewhere. Another driver, very important, is the impact of Western intervention in places like Libya, where, as you know, there isn't much of a government.
We could spend some time for why we're getting these great shifts of population from Africa towards Europe. We could spend a whole day talking about that. We haven't got a whole day, we've got 8 minutes. So, Tony, let's talk about how to deal with this immediate problem. The Australian Prime Minister, Tony Abbott's explicit. He says, look at our experience. He says 2 or 3 years ago, we had 3 boats a day coming to Australia. Since they got tough, since the turn of the year, they've had none, and no people have lost their lives. He says if you want to stop the deaths, it's quite simple, you stop the boats.
Yeah, well, actually, since I retired from the UK Border Force, I've been doing a bit of work down there with the Australians, who actually, funnily enough, are about to create their own Australian Border Force on the 1st of July this year. They've merged immigration and customs together and created, with their defence assets, a mobile patrol capability to patrol not just their local waters, but also international waters. And I think this is, you know, when you transpose that to the EU, this is where we've run into problems on governance and who is responsible. I was a member of the European Border Agency, Frontex, when that was created in 2006. I went to the first meetings of those, and the vision was that we would have this, you know, ring of steel around Europe, which would be very heavily funded and resourced with proper command and control. That hasn't really happened, and I think now we're beginning to pay for that, and we're beginning to see the signs of that being reversed. But I still think there's a lot of details to emerge about how this force will operate in future in the Mediterranean, and as you say, how will it actually engage with the, you know, the points of disembarkation in these sort of lawless ports in Libya.
Anders Lusgaard, when it comes to responsibility, I mean, I know you were saying a few moments ago, actually, it's complicated. You can look at big global organisations like the World Bank, but at base, in terms of principal responsibilities, we look at more migrants being offloaded into Catania. The principal responsibility, and we're seeing a court action today in Sicily too, involving the captain of the vessel which foundered on Sunday. The principal responsibility lies with the people smugglers.
Well, they are the symptoms of deeper causes. I mean,
they're criminals, aren't they? They're criminals who are causing misery and taking lives.
Sure, but are you going to stop a consistent flow of people? There is a massive demand, and the demand is primarily caused by the way that we have engaged with poor countries. If we weren't supporting, say, the Sisi regime in Egypt, which is cracking down on dissidents, which is cracking down on Muslims and repressing the Arab Spring, the drivers wouldn't be there. So, of course, the people who are making money out of this are morally reprehensible, but they are the symptoms of a deeper cause. If we treat this as primarily a problem of security, we're going to go down the same road that we had with the war on drugs, which produced more drugs, and the war on terror, which produced more terror. This is not a situation of crisis or of security. This is fundamentally a situation of humanitarian need.
In terms of the policing action, Anders, can we learn nothing from the experience that Tony Smith was just talking about, which seems to, on paper at least, have been successful in Australia? Can we learn nothing from what's happened in Somalia, where a mission, an EU/UN mission, has actually at times gone inland, sequestrated and destroyed the boats of people who meant to do people on the high seas harm?
Well, I wouldn't in any way say that I know as much about border patrol as Tony does. What I would say is that the idea of using, which is what the EU are proposing this morning, helicopter gunships to bomb migrant boats, that just has disaster written all over it. That has pain and drownings written all over it. These are already very fragile boats. They overturn at the best of times.
I don't think anybody here recognises that characterisation of the EU mission. Tony, do you?
No, it's not. I mean, the move is in the right direction. You know, we are supporting, the UK government is supporting the European initiative to put more resources in the Mediterranean Sea. That is essential. That didn't happen under Operation Triton this year. That was a mistake to cut resources there. What I'm really interested in is command and control and some of these really difficult decisions that we're debating, because we do need to send a message back, and this is where the media can help, to these would-be refugees who we can sympathise with. Don't fall into the hands of human smugglers. They will take your money away from you, and you may end up drowning. They don't get that message. They are told that this is a straightforward process, hand over the money, we'll sail you out at least into the Mediterranean, and if you get that far you still don't need to worry, because if you do get picked up by a passing vessel you will be taken into Europe and you will be allowed to stay there. That is patently the wrong message to give. You're right in saying this is being run by criminal gangs. We really need to support the international law enforcement effort to get after the traffickers and the racketeers.
Let's talk numbers. Anders Lusgarden, the Italians say anything up to 1 million people are warehoused at the moment in Libya, waiting for the opportunity to move to Italy or other parts of Europe. Would you say to all of them, come on in?
It doesn't really work like that, does it? I mean, I would say that one of the things we need to look at is faster and more streamlined applications in home countries, which we have a rapidly aging demographic in this country. Migration's complex, but we as a country do require an increase in skilled and talented people. We already have an economy that relies heavily on migration. So to sort of demonise these people and see them as parasites is really wrong.
But surely that becomes an argument about legal migration. If you've got a skill shortage, you make sure you bring in people who've got skills.
Right.
The point about what we're seeing with the people even on the ship we're looking at there in Catania, we know nothing about these people. We saw people being buried yesterday. We didn't know what their names were. We didn't know what their religion was. We didn't know their nationality. We certainly didn't know whether they were good plumbers or skilled in another way that was going to supply a shortage caused by a demographic crisis in the West.
No, what I'm saying is there is already a massive need and demand for skills in this country. So if we made it easier for people to apply before they get on these boats and sped up that process and acknowledge that we are a rapidly changing demographic in Europe, the fundamental reality is that our governments refuse to acknowledge the nature and need for migration in this country because of a fairly loud xenophobic minority. And what's been really encouraging about the last few days is that there's been a really strong, compassionate backlash from a lot of normal people, which has pushed the EU into sort of restoring some of the elements that were cut when they cut Mare Nostrum and moved to Triton. But Mare Nostrum had 900 people working in it full time. Triton has 60. So even tripling that isn't putting us back to a level that was already causing 4,000 deaths. So it's not about military intervention, it's about humanitarian work here.
Tony Smith, time was, I suppose, when you were heading up the UK border force, you couldn't get involved in politics. You're not the head of the UK border force anymore, so now you can. 11 o'clock this morning, we're going to take a speech live from Ed Miliband, in which he's going to talk about foreign policy generally, but at one point we're told, specifically he'll mention Libya. He'll say that he supported the action originally, but the way things have been allowed to go since then is a source of some shame for the UK. Now, it begs the question, doesn't it, that we got involved in removing Colonel Gaddafi. Libya is now a basket case, and therefore we owe some responsibility to the people who are fleeing Libya or coming through it.
Yes, I mean, I think we need to take into account current events that happen. I worked for a number of governments of different hues and colours for over 40 years, and there's a lot of commonality between them. There is nothing in any of the manifestos to suggest that we will, for example, join Schengen, tear down our internal frontiers, or maintain a fairly rigid, strict immigration policy. And I think some of the points we're hearing about the humanitarian response are very valid, because, you know, there's 1.6 million refugees we hear now in Turkey. That's an awful lot of people, and the UN, trying to resettle those people around the world, are having huge problems finding countries agreeing to take them. And actually the UK takes very, very few of those. We only really take in asylum seekers who happen to get into the UK in the first place and claim asylum at our shore. So I mean, I think there is something about how do you deal with this huge numbers of people that are being displaced, either for temporary migration or for permanent migration, but more importantly, how do we, as you say, engage with these lawless ports of entry where, you know, you have to have some kind of intervention strategy.
Listen, one final thought as we look again at these pictures from Catania. We've been looking at pictures like this all week, and it was all sparked by those events on Sunday when a vessel sank, capsized, people below in the hold, anything up to 800 people perished. One piece of essential arithmetic involved is that this all happened. The boat sank just 17 miles from the Libyan coast. Anders Lusgarden, at what point, geographically, do these boat people become Europe's responsibility? How many miles do they need to be away? Do they need to be in international waters? Do they need to have just left port? I mean, it may seem a technical point, but it's an important one.
It is an important one, and it makes the EU's 10-point plan sort of invalid in many respects, because in international maritime terms, they are in international waters, and that makes them, that doesn't mean that the EU has an entitlement to intervene. So there is a difference. I would come back to the difference between Mare Nostrum, which was a Mediterranean-wide search and rescue program, and Triton, which is limited to within 30 miles of the Italian coast. And if we have a system that is internationally organized for search and rescue and rehabilitation of injured people, that's by far the most important thing we can do now. I take Tony's point about intervening at the points of origin, but if we don't address the structural factors and the humanitarian factors, in my opinion, we are abdicating our responsibilities.
OK. Tweet your thoughts to @Colin Brazier Sky, Anders Lusgarden, Tony Smith. Thanks both very much indeed. Straight to Lincoln.